By the authority vested in me, I hereby inform you that your forces have unconditionally surrendered.
The first German soldier realized the war was lost not when the guards spoke, but when they stopped shouting. Silence fell over the prisoner compound like a dropped curtain, sudden and unnatural, as if the world itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. For months, noise had been constant: boots on growl, shouted orders, slammed gates, engines coughing awake before dawn. Now there was only wind moving through barbed wire and the low, uncertain murmur of men who no longer understood where history had placed them. Unteroffizier Karl Weiss stood near the fence, his fingers wrapped around rusted wire he had touched 100 times before. The metal was cold. It had always been cold. But today it felt heavier, as though it carried meaning at last. Across the compound, hundreds of German prisoners of war, Afrika Korps veterans, Luftwaffe mechanics, exhausted infantrymen pulled from shattered divisions shifted uneasily. They had been captured weeks ago during the collapse in the West, funneled into this temporary holding camp somewhere in England. No one had told them where exactly. Geography no longer mattered. What mattered was this: the guards were late. That had never happened before. Karl glanced toward the watchtower. The British sentry stood there, rifle slung casually, not rigid, not alert. He was smiling. Not at anyone in particular, just smiling, like a man watching rain finally stop after a long storm. Karl felt something tighten in his chest. For years, the Reich had taught them that smiles like that only belonged to victors. The camp that wasn't supposed to exist, the camp itself, was unfinished. That alone should have meant nothing, but to trained soldiers it meant everything. The barracks were rough timber thrown together quickly, mud pooled between them. Supplies arrived irregularly. Red Cross parcels came without ceremony. The British had not bothered to make the place impressive. Why would they? Karl remembered the words drilled into him back. In 1942, England is a dying empire. America is soft. The Reich will decide when the war ends. Yet here he was, standing behind wire in a camp the enemy had built in a hurry because they needed room, because prisoners were arriving faster than they could be counted. And today, something had changed. A whisper rippled through the compound. They say Berlin was bombed again. They say the Americans crossed another river. They say the Führer is dead. No one knew which rumor to believe. Rumors had been their oxygen since capture, but today the whispers carried a different tone, not panic, not hope. Recognition. Karl turned as his closest friend in the camp, Friedrich Lehmann, approached. Friedrich had been a schoolteacher before the war, conscripted late, captured early. His uniform still looked too large on him, as if borrowed from a life he never wanted. "You feel it too," Friedrich said quietly. Karl nodded. They're not hiding it anymore. Not hiding what? That they've already won. The guard's eyes, the true moment, did not come with an announcement. It came at breakfast. Tin plates clattered onto tables. Porridge was ladled out without counting. One British corporal joked with another, joked about football scores. A guard handed a cigarette to a prisoner without demanding anything in return. That was unheard of. Karl watched it happen from across the mess area, his stomach twisting harder than hunger ever could. For years, fear had structured every interaction between captor and captive. Fear kept balance. Fear kept order. But now the guards were relaxed. Victors relax. A British officer finally stepped forward. He was young, barely older than Karl, with tired eyes and a folded paper in his hand. He cleared his throat, not sharply, not formally, almost apologetically. "Men," he began, in careful German, "there will be no work detail today." A pause. "No roll call this evening." Another pause. "You'll remain in the compound until further notice." That was all. No threats, no explanations, just until further notice. The officer turned and walked away. No one moved. Then a single voice somewhere near the back laughed. It was a broken sound, half sobbing, half relieved. Others followed. Not cheers, not celebration. just laughter, the kind that comes when a lie finally collapses under its own weight. The moment settles in. Carl sat on his bunk long after the others drifted into quiet conversation. He stared at his hands, still strong, still uninjured, still capable of violence. For years those hands had belonged to something larger than himself. Now they belonged to no one. Across from him, Friedrich whispered, Do you think it? Really over? Carl did he answer right away. He thought of Stalingrad, of letters that stopped coming, of orders that made less sense each month, of victory maps that no longer matched reality. Yes, he said finally, I think this is what defeat feels like. Outside, the wind rattled the wire again, but this time it did sound like a cage. It sounded like an ending. The next morning arrived without ceremony, and that too felt wrong. Karl Weiss woke before the bell, before any bell, because there was no bell anymore. The camp no longer operated on sharp edges of time, no shouted Aufstehen, no boots pounding down the aisle. Just a slow, grey dawn leaking through the cracks in the wooden barracks. For a moment he lay still, listening. Men were awake. He could hear it in the breathing, too controlled, too alert. Soldiers never truly slept when something fundamental had shifted. They waited. Karl sat up. Around him, others did the same, exchanging looks heavy with unspoken questions. No one rushed outside. No one lined up. Discipline, once instinctive, now hesitated. And hesitation, Karl realized, was new. The day the war did arrive outside, the compound looked unchanged, mud, wire, watchtowers, but the rhythm was gone. Guards stood in smaller numbers. Rifles rested against shoulders. Instead of being held ready, one sentry leaned against the tower rail, sipping tea as if this were any quiet countryside morning. That image struck Karl harder than any blow. Tea, leisure, normality. This was not how men behaved when they feared reversal. Friedrich joined him near the fence. His face was pale, eyes red from lack of sleep. I dreamed I was back in my classroom, Friedrich said. The children were older than me. Karl nodded. That's what happens when the future catches up. They watched a group of British soldiers unload crates near the supply shed. No urgency, no escort. One crate burst open, spilling newspapers onto the ground. Newspapers, in German. Karl felt his pulse spike. The paper that ended a war. The guards did not stop the prisoners when they drifted closer. That alone felt like permission. A few men bent down, fingers trembling, lifting pages printed in unmistakable black type. Berlin umzingelt. Encircled. Another headline, Allied forces enter German cities. Karl's mouth went dry. He took a paper from a trembling hand and scanned faster than he could fully comprehend. Place names leapt off the page. Cologne, Frankfurt, Hamburg, cities he had marched through in parades, now listed as battlegrounds or ruins. There was no language of triumph in the articles. No exaggeration, just facts, dates, confirmed reports. Friedrich leaned in, whispering, read this. Karl did. Reich communications severely disrupted. Civil administration collapsing. Unconditional surrender increasingly discussed. Karl lowered the paper slowly. No denial followed. No counter-rumor rose to challenge it. Because there was nothing left to argue with. This one's the enemy propaganda shouted through loudspeakers. This was the quiet, printed truth. The weight of years around them, reactions spread in waves. One man sank to his knees, pressing his forehead into the mud, whispering prayers no one else could hear. Another tore the eagle insignia from his uniform and buried it under his boot heel. A third laughed hysterically, shouting, so it was all for this. Until others pulled him away. Karl felt none of those things immediately. Instead, he felt tired. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that no amount of sleep could touch. He thought of his father, who had fought in the last war and warned him how defeat really arrived not with explosions, but with realization. One day, his father had said, "You will wake up and understand that everything you believed was a structure built on sand." Karl finally understood. The guards speak carefully that afternoon. The camp commandant assembled the prisoners again. No barked orders, no intimidation. Just men standing in rows that were no longer perfectly straight. The commandant, a major with grey hair and a face carved by fatigue, cleared his throat. "You will hear many things in the coming days," he said in measured German. "Some will be true, some will not. What I can tell you is this: hostilities are ending faster than anyone expected." A murmur passed through the ranks. "Your treatment will not worsen." The major continued. "You will not be returned to combat. You are prisoners of war, and you will remain so until formal resolutions are completed." Someone shouted, "What about Germany?" The major paused. Then quietly, "Germany's broken." The words fell like stones into water. No one argued. The moment spreads beyond the fence that night. Karl lay awake again, staring at the rafters. Rain tapped softly on the roof. Somewhere a man was crying, not loudly, not for attention, just letting grief finally breathe. Karl thought of the long marches, the slogans, the certainty that had carried them through fire and snow. He thought of orders obeyed without question, choices never examined, and he felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Not shame, not yet, something closer to responsibility. Friedrich broke the silence. "Do you think they'll let us go home?" "Yes," Karl said slowly, "but not to the place we left." Friedrich turned to face him. "Then what do we do now?" Karl did answer right away. Outside, the guards laughed openly now, sharing a joke that had nothing to do with prisoners or war. Karl closed his eyes. "We learn," he said at last, "what it means to live without lies. The knowledge no one could take back by the third day. No one pretended anymore." The POWs spoke openly. About defeat. About crimes whispered but never named. About fear of what waited beyond the wire. Some clung to denial, insisting the Führer would reveal a miracle. But those voices sounded thin, brittle, like glass already cracking. Karl watched them with quiet sadness, because he knew the moment had already passed. The moment when German POWs knew the war was lost was marked by surrender papers or flags. It was marked by this when belief died faster than hope. And once belief was gone, there was no rebuilding it. The war was ending, but something else, something deeper, was only beginning. The days that followed did not blur together. They separated cleanly, painfully, each one cutting a deeper line between who the men had been and who they were becoming. Karl Weiss noticed it first in the conversations. They were quieter now, slower, less certain. Where once the prisoners had argued tactics and blamed generals, they now spoke of home in hesitant fragments, as if afraid memory itself might accuse them. Names of wives were mentioned, then dropped. Children existed only as ages, not faces. Entire years of life felt suddenly unreal, like a story told too often to survive belief. On the fourth morning, Karl was assigned to kitchen duty not as punishment, but as necessity. The British were reorganizing camps across the country, processing thousands of prisoners. Efficiency mattered more than intimidation now. That, too, said everything. The taste of normality, peeling potatoes, should not have felt revolutionary. Yet as Karl stood at a wooden table, knives scraping skins into a bucket, he felt something loosen inside his chest. No shouting, no countdown, no fear of being watched for weakness, just work. A British sergeant supervised them, older, broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his temple down to his cheek. He spoke little, but when he did, it was without malice. At one point, the sergeant glanced at Karl's hands. "You were infantry," he said. "Yes." The sergeant nodded. Figured. No judgment followed. That unsettled Karl more than anger ever could. The first question no one asked before that afternoon, Friedrich found Karl sitting near the fence again, watching clouds roll low over the fields beyond. They showed a film in the admin hut, Friedrich said quietly. Karl looked up. "What kind of film?" "Newsreel." Something in Friedrich's voice tightened Karl's stomach. "About what?" Friedrich swallowed. "About camps. In Poland." Karl stood. "Prison camps." Friedrich shook his head. "Not like this. The word camp hung between them, suddenly insufficient. They didn't force anyone to watch, Friedrich continued. But some guards, they said it was time. Karl felt his pulse in his throat. Did you see it? Yes. And Friedrich's eyes were distant now. I don't know how to carry it. Seeing without orders that evening, Karl went to the admin hut. The guards didn't stop him. Inside, a projector hummed softly. A handful of prisoners sat on benches, faces lit by flickering black and white images. No commentary, no music, just footage. Barbed wire stretching to the horizon. Emaciated men staring at the camera with hollow eyes. Piles of shoes, hair, glasses. Karl's breath grew shallow. This was not battlefield cruelty, not collateral damage explained away by necessity. This was systematized, deliberate. The room was silent except for the machine. Karl realized something terrifying in that moment. No one was telling him what to think. No slogans framed the images. No officer explained context. This was reality without narrative armor. When the film ended, no one spoke. Some men left immediately. Others stayed seated, unable to move. Karl walked outside into cold air that felt suddenly unreal. The war, he understood now, had not merely been lost. It had been exposed. The collapse of identity that night. The barracks did not sleep. Arguments erupted, some furious, some desperate. This is Allied fabrication. Then why did they stop us from watching? We didn't know, didn't we? Karl listened, silent. He had marched past trains. He had ignored smells he could place. He had accepted explanations because questioning would have cost him certainty. The lie had not only been imposed, it had been convenient. Friedrich sat beside him, head in his hands. I taught history, Friedrich whispered. I told children that nations fall when they forget morality. Karl said nothing. What do I tell them now? Friedrich asked. Karl answered quietly, the truth, even if it burns. The guard who broke the silence the next day, the scarred British sergeant, approached Karl during cleanup. You saw the film, he said. Yes. The sergeant nodded slowly. My brother helped liberate one of those places. Karl waited. He hasn't slept since, the sergeant continued. Neither have we. He met Karl's eyes. This isn't about revenge. About ending something so it never hides again. Karl felt a strange, sharp relief. Not forgiveness, but clarity. Letters that could no longer be written. Red Cross forms were distributed later that week. Prisoners were allowed to write home. Karl stared at the blank paper for a long time. What do you write when the country you are addressing no longer exists as you understood it? He began, stopped, tore the page in half. Around him, others struggled too, some writing desperately, others unable to start at all. Friedrich finally wrote one sentence. I am alive, I am thinking. He folded the letter carefully as if it were fragile glass. The war ends inside the wire. The official announcement came days later. Germany had surrendered, unconditional. The camp did not erupt. There were no cheers, no riots, no violence. Just men standing still, absorbing the final confirmation of something they had already known. Karl closed his eyes. He felt grief not for defeat, but for the years spent believing in something that demanded blindness as loyalty. The guards lowered their weapons that evening, not symbolically. Practically, the war was over, but the reckoning, personal, moral, irreversible, had only just begun. Karl understood now that history would not ask only what happened. It would ask who allowed it. And each man behind the wire would have to answer not to courts alone, but to himself. The announcement did not change the sky. Karl noticed that first. He had expected something, thunder perhaps, or a sudden clarity in the air, but the clouds drifted on as they always had, indifferent to surrender, to history, to men standing in mud, realizing the world had crossed an invisible line without them. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. The words moved through the camp slowly, not shouted, not proclaimed. Passed from mouth to mouth like something fragile, something that might shatter if spoken too loudly. Karl felt no urge to sit or stand. He simply remained where he was, hands at his sides, as if waiting for orders that would never come again. Across the compound, Friedrich leaned against a barracks wall, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Not prayer. Rehearsal. As if he were already practicing how to explain this moment to someone who wants to there. Freedom without release. In the days that followed, the camp loosened further. The guards unlocked inner gates. Work details became voluntary. Some prisoners were allowed supervised walks beyond the wire, along narrow country roads bordered by hedges and spring flowers that felt offensively alive. Freedom, Karl learned, could arrive before readiness. On one such walk, he found himself beside a young British private whose rifle was slung casually across his back. "Strange, isn't it?" the private said, gesturing at the fields. Karl nodded, that the world kept going, that it always does. They walked in silence for a while. "My mother thinks the war ended the day my brother came home," the private said. "I think it'll end when people stop waking up angry." Karl absorbed that. He had been waking up angry for years without realizing it. The talk no one could avoid. The camp commandant called another assembly. This time he did not stand elevated. He stood among them. "There will be tribunals," he said plainly. "Investigations. Some of you will be questioned. Some will be released sooner than others." A ripple of tension passed through the ranks. "This is not collective punishment," the commandant continued, "but it is collective responsibility to face what happened." Someone shouted, "We were soldiers." "Yes," the commandant replied calmly, "and soldiers still make choices." Silence followed, not the stunned silence of ignorance. The heavy silence of recognition. The midpoint of knowing. And by the way, if you are clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe. More waits just ahead, and this story isn't finished yet. Karl realized something then, standing among defeated men and victorious guards who looked just as tired. This was the true midpoint of the war. Not surrender, but comprehension. The moment when excuses stopped working. Friedrich's confession that night. Friedrich finally spoke aloud what he had been circling for days. "I corrected essays," he said suddenly, staring at the floor. "I failed students for weak sources, for propaganda disguised as truth." Karl listened. "And then," Friedrich continued, voice shaking, "I accepted lies because they were stamped with authority." Karl did interrupt. "I wasn't innocent," Friedrich whispered. "I was convenient." Karl felt the words lodge inside him. Convenience. How many times had he chosen it over doubt? Letters returned. Unopened a week later, letters came back. Some marked address unknown. Others simply returned without explanation. Germany was no longer a fixed place. Cities were rubble, families displaced, names erased. Karl received nothing. No confirmation of death, no reassurance of life, just absence. He folded the empty envelope carefully and placed it under his mattress as if it was something precious. The guard who asked a question, the scarred sergeant, found Karl again, this time without preamble. "When you go home," he asked, "what will you tell people you did?" Karl didn't answer immediately. "I'll tell them what I didn't stop," he said finally. The sergeant nodded once. That might be enough. The night of reckoning that evening, a fight broke out. Two prisoners, both former officers, came to blows over blame, over hierarchy, over who should have known more. Guards intervened quickly, but the damage was done. The illusion of shared suffering fractured. Karl watched from a distance, understanding something vital. Defeat had united them. Truth was dividing them. The choice ahead. Days later, volunteers were requested. Men who would assist Allied documentation teams, mapping units, identifying officers, explaining command structures. Collaborators, some whispered. Witnesses, others said. Karl stepped forward. So did Friedrich. Not because they were brave, but because silence now felt like a second crime. As Karl signed his name, he felt fear, but also something lighter beneath it. Purpose, stripped of delusion. The war's final shape that night. Carl stood once more at the fence. Beyond it, the road curved gently out of sight. For years, he had believed the war would end with victory or death. He had been wrong. It ended with responsibility, and that, he knew, would last longer than any captivity. The first names were called at dawn, not shouted, not announced with ceremony. Just read aloud by a clerk standing beside the gate, his voice steady, almost bored, as if reciting train departures. Each name landed differently. Some men stiffened, some exhaled in relief, others looked around in quiet panic, as if hoping not to recognize themselves in the sound. Carl Weiss heard his name midway through the list, not early, not last, exactly where a man of no particular rank or notoriety belonged. He stepped forward without hesitation. Friedrich's name followed shortly after. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The room with no flags, the interrogation room, was smaller than Carl expected. No banners, no emblems, just a table, 2 chairs, a window cracked open to let in air that smelled faintly of wet grass. 3 Allied officers waited inside, British and American each, with folders stacked neatly in front of them. No one raised their voice. That was the most unsettling part. They asked about units, movements, names. Carl answered carefully, not to protect himself, but to be accurate. He corrected himself when memory wavered. He admitted ignorance where it existed. At one point, an American officer asked, "Did you ever suspect?" Carl paused. "Yes," he said, but suspicion felt dangerous. The officer wrote something down. No reaction, no judgment offered. Just record. Friedrich breaks. Friedrich did not fare as smoothly. Carl could hear muffled voices through the thin wall. Not shouting, never shouting, but Friedrich's voice rose once, cracked, then fell into silence. When Friedrich emerged an hour later, his face looked older, as if time had accelerated in that room. "They asked me what I taught," Friedrich said quietly. "And history?" Friedrich replied. "They asked why I didn't question the version I was given." Carl placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "What did you say?" "That I mistook obedience for virtue." The waiting after answers interrogations did not end things. They extended them. Weeks passed. Some men were transferred, some released to labor units. Others disappeared into a different system, entirely one with fewer details shared. Carl and Friedrich remained in the camp, now quieter, emptier. The war felt increasingly distant, like a storm remembered after the ground had dried. One afternoon, a truck arrived carrying German civilians, refugees being temporarily housed before relocation. Women, children, a girl no older than 10 stared at the prisoners with open curiosity. Carl felt something twist inside him. She was seeing them without fear, without ideology. Just men in worn uniforms. And that felt heavier than any accusation. The question of home news filtered in slowly. Cities destroyed, borders redrawn, a country divided not just by politics, but by memory. "Home," Friedrich said one evening, "might not recognize us." Carl stared at the horizon. "Then we'll have to recognize it." They spoke of returning not as a right, but as a responsibility. What would they say if asked? What would they refuse to say again? The day Carl was released, Carl's release came without warning. A guard called his name and handed him papers stamped with more authority than he had ever held. "You'll be transported south tomorrow," the guard said. "Processing center." Then civilian status. Carl nodded, heart pounding. Friedrich would remain longer. His role as a witness extended his captivity. They stood together that night, beneath a sky surprisingly full of stars. "I'll write," Carl said. Friedrich smiled faintly. "Write honestly." "I will." They embraced, not as soldiers, not as prisoners, as men uncertain whether they deserved survival. Crossing the gate the next morning, Carl walked through the gate, not rushed, not pushed. The wire opened. The road waited. He did not feel triumphant. He felt exposed. Every step away from the camp felt like entering a question he could never fully answer. A British driver glanced at him as he climbed into the truck. "You'll figure it out." the man said casually. Carl wondered how many people would ever be allowed to believe that. The world without instructions. As the truck rolled forward, the camp receded. Carl watched it disappear, not with relief but with clarity. That place had taught him more truth than any battlefield. Ahead lay ruins, rebuilding, and conversations that would hurt more than silence ever had. The war had ended behind him, but its meaning was only beginning to take shape. And Carl knew without doubt that the moment German POWs realized the war was lost was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of accountability. Carl Weiss returned to Germany on a grey afternoon that felt deliberately unremarkable. The train slowed as it passed through a station that barely resembled the photographs he remembered. Platforms were cracked. Signs hung crooked, their lettering faded or burned. Whole sections of the town beyond were simply gone, flattened into uneven fields of stone and ash where streets had once carried names, laughter, routine. No one greeted the arriving passengers. There were no officials, no speeches, no flags of any kind. Only people moving carefully through ruins, as if afraid that history itself might collapse again if stepped on too heavily. Carl stepped down from the train, carrying a small bag that held everything he owned. The uniform he had once worn was gone, replaced by borrowed civilian clothes that felt unfamiliar on his skin. For the first time since boyhood, no institution claimed him. He stood still for a long moment, absorbing the sound of his own breathing. This, he realized, was what surrender looked like from the inside. A country that would not look away. Germany did not meet its returning soldiers with rage, nor with forgiveness. It met them with exhaustion. Carl walked through streets where people rebuilt walls without speaking, stacking bricks salvaged from ruins whose owners might never return. Posters covered what remained of intact buildings, directives from occupation authorities, ration instructions, announcements of missing persons. And, increasingly, notices of trials. Names were printed in tight columns. Some were famous. Many were not. Carl recognized a few. He stopped reading after his hands began to shake. This was not vengeance. This was accounting. Home, rewritten. Carl's family home no longer existed. A neighbor older stooped, her eyes sharp with the alertness of someone who had learned not to trust. Silence told him his parents had fled west months earlier. Alive, she said. Last I heard. The relief was immediate and followed instantly by guilt for feeling it. Carl slept his first nights in a shelter with strangers. No one asked where he had been. No one offered stories of heroism. War was not a subject people approached directly anymore. It hovered instead, present in pauses, in glances, in the way voices dropped when footsteps passed too close. When people did speak, they spoke of survival, not glory. Friedrich's letter. The letter arrived weeks later. Carl recognized Friedrich's handwriting immediately, careful, precise, still shaped by the habits of a teacher. I will be released soon, it began. They asked me to stay longer, to explain, to translate, to remember clearly. Carl exhaled slowly. Some men refused. Friedrich continued. They wanted the past sealed. I couldn't do that anymore. The letter ended with a line Carl read 3 times before folding the paper carefully. We lost the war when we stopped asking questions. Let's not lose the peace the same way. Living without uniforms. Carl found work clearing rubble for a rebuilding crew. The labor was hard, anonymous and honest. No ranks, no salutes, just shared weight and shared fatigue. One afternoon, a young man beside him asked casually, "Were you in the army?" Carl paused. "Yes," he said. No follow-up came. That silence felt earned. At night, Carl volunteered with an allied education program, helping translate documents, explain military structures, identify locations. It was not redemption. He did not pretend it was. But it was participation in truth. And that mattered. The trial he did not attend when Friedrich was finally released. They met in a small cafe that served weak coffee and nothing else. They embraced awkwardly. 2 men unsure how to occupy peace. "I testified," Friedrich said quietly. Karl nodded. I know. They didn't ask me to accuse, Friedrich continued, only to describe. That is harder. Yes, they spoke of those who had not survived, of those who would never be tried because history had already judged them, of those who would walk free carrying silence like armor. Do you think people will forgive us? Friedrich asked. Karl considered. No, he said, but they might listen if we speak honestly enough. The true moment, finally understood years later, Karl would often return to a single memory, not the surrender announcement, not the newspapers, not even the film footage that had shattered his certainty. It was the moment in the camp when the guards had stopped shouting, when authority no longer needed volume, when power rested not in fear but in inevitability. That was when German POWs knew the war was lost, because in that silence they understood something irreversible. The war had not only failed militarily, it had failed morally. And once that truth was seen, it could not be unseen. What history would ask Karl grew older. Germany rebuilt. Children were taught a different version of history, one that included footnotes where slogans used to be. Sometimes, students asked Karl questions during public discussions. Why did people stop it sooner? Karl always answered the same way, because stopping it meant giving up comfort, certainty and belonging, and most people don't realize what those cost until they were gone. The end that was not an ending. On a quiet evening many years later, Karl stood near a rebuilt railway line, watching a train pass smoothly through a landscape once shattered beyond recognition. He felt no pride, but he felt resolve. The war had ended long ago. The defeat had been total, necessary, and the moment German POWs knew the war was lost had not been a single second, but a process, a waking up, a reckoning, a choice to live without lies. Karl turned and walked home. History would move on, but memory, honest, painful, essential, would remain. And that, he believed, was the only victory left worth claiming.